Blood dripped down her bruised calf, staining her torn sheer stockings. "I'm so sorry I'm late," Penelope gasped, bracing her heavy frame against the mahogany doorframe. Mateo, the ruthless head of the Chicago syndicate, didn't care about the missing $2 million anymore. His dead, cold eyes locked instantly onto her shattered knee. Rain hammered against the slick, cracked pavement of Chicago's West Loop, washing away the grime of the city, but doing nothing to cleanse the terror gripping Penelope Hayes. Every step she took sent a blinding, white-hot spike of agony shooting up from her right knee to her hip. She dragged her leg, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, her wet hair plastered against her cheeks. She was 20 minutes late. For a regular business meeting, 20 minutes was a faux pas. For a meeting with Mateo Navarro, the undisputed king of the Navarro crime family, 20 minutes late was a death sentence. Penelope knew the stories. Everyone in the city's underground financial district knew the stories. Mateo didn't negotiate, he didn't compromise, and he certainly didn't wait. Penelope clutched her ruined purse to her chest, her knuckles entirely white. She was a plus-size accountant, a woman who had spent her entire 32 years of life trying desperately to take up less space, to apologize for her soft curves and heavy thighs in a world that demanded sharp angles and perfection. She wore dark, shapeless clothes. She kept her head down. She worked hard. None of it had saved her. Her ex-fiancé, Jimmy Garrison, had seen to that. Jimmy was a charming, silver-tongued parasite who had used Penelope's legitimate accounting firm to quietly launder money for the Navarro family. Penelope had been completely blind to it, blinded by the rare affection of a man she thought actually loved her, despite her weight, despite her insecurities. 2 days ago, Jimmy vanished, leaving behind a gutted bank account and a $2 million deficit in Mateo Navarro's ledgers. He also left Penelope's signature on every fraudulent document. 10 minutes ago, as she had rushed from the L train station toward the private restaurant where Mateo had summoned her, 3 men had cornered her in a blind alley. They weren't muggers. They wore expensive leather jackets and carried heavy, lead-weighted pipes. Jimmy owes the Volkoffs 2 fatty, one had hissed, slamming the pipe into the back of her knee. Consider this a down payment. She had survived only because a stray police cruiser had flashed its lights at the end of the alley, scattering the thugs into the shadows. Left in the mud, Penelope had forced herself up. She had to get to Mateo. If she didn't show up to explain, he would send his own men to her mother's house in Evanston. She couldn't let that happen. Gasping for air, Penelope finally reached the heavy, unmarked brass doors of Il Cacciatore, an exclusive closed-door establishment owned by the syndicate. The 2 massive guards flanking the entrance took one look at her soaked, mud-stained navy dress, her bleeding leg, and her terrified, tear-streaked face. Without a word, one of them pulled the heavy door open. The interior was a stark contrast to the brutal storm outside. Warm amber lighting the scent of truffles and expensive cigars, and the soft hum of jazz filled the expansive, empty dining room. The restaurant had been completely cleared out for this meeting. At the far end of the room, sitting at a long table draped in pristine white linen, was Mateo Navarro. He was a terrifyingly beautiful man, carved from Sicilian marble and cold cruelty. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, he sat with a glass of scotch in one hand, staring at the door. Beside him stood his enforcer, Carmine, a man whose face was a map of old knife scars. Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took a step forward, and her right knee completely buckled. She caught herself on the edge of a leather booth, knocking over a crystal glass that shattered on the hardwood floor. The sharp sound echoed through the silent restaurant like a gunshot. I am so sorry," Penelope stammered, her voice trembling violently. She forced herself to stand upright, ignoring the searing pain in her leg. Her wet clothes clung uncomfortably to her heavy frame, making her feel incredibly vulnerable and exposed. "I'm sorry I'm late, Mr. Navarro. I have the files. I have the proof that Jimmy—" Mateo didn't look at the wet manila folder she held up. He didn't look at her flushed, panicked face. His dark, fathomless eyes dropped directly to her legs. The sheer black pantyhose on her right leg was shredded from the mid-calf to the thigh. Dark, thick crimson blood oozed from a nasty, jagged gash on her knee, dripping down her calf and pooling into her ruined leather flats. The surrounding flesh was already swelling, turning a sick, mottled shade of purple. The air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Mateo slowly set his scotch glass down on the table. The soft clink sounded deafening. "You're bleeding," Mateo said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. It held no anger about the money. It held something far more dangerous. "It's nothing," Penelope choked out, trying to take another step forward to hand him the files, desperate to prove her innocence. "Jimmy framed me. I swear to you, I didn't know about the 2 million. If you just give me time, I can liquidate my firm, I can—" "Stop walking," Mateo commanded softly. Penelope froze. Mateo stood up. He was well over 6 feet tall, a predator uncoiling from his throne. He bypassed the table, his polished shoes making no sound against the wood, and closed the distance between them in seconds. Penelope squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow, waiting for him to pull a gun or order Carmine to finish what the men in the alley had started. Instead, she felt large, warm hands grip her waist. "Open your eyes, Penelope," Mateo ordered. She gasped, her eyes snapping open. Mateo was standing inches from her. Up close, she could smell the bergamot and danger radiating from his skin. He wasn't looking at her with the disgust she was so used to seeing from men when they looked at her body. His gaze was intense, burning with a dark, furious fire that was entirely directed elsewhere. "Who did this?" Mateo asked, his thumb gently brushing against the soaked fabric of her dress at her hip. The money." Penelope sobbed, entirely confused. "I don't have it." "Fuck the money." Mateo snarled, the sudden violence in his voice making her flinch. Instantly, his expression smoothed out, though his jaw remained clenched tight. "I asked you a question, Tesoro. Who touched you?" Penelope stared at the Mafia boss in absolute bewilderment. Why did he care? She was a fat, plain accountant who owed him a fortune. She was collateral damage. Jimmy had always told her she was lucky to have him, because nobody else would ever look twice at a woman her size. Yet here was Mateo Navarro, a man who could summon supermodels with a snap of his fingers, staring at her injuries with murderous intent. 3 men, she whispered, her teeth chattering from the cold and the shock. In the alley off Racine. They had pipes. They said Jimmy owed the Volkovs. Mateo's eyes darkened to pitch black. The Russians. He turned his head slightly, not breaking eye contact with Penelope. "Carmine." "On it, boss," the enforcer replied instantly, already pulling a burner phone from his jacket as he headed for the kitchen doors. "I'll get the boys on the street. Nobody breathes in the West Loop without us knowing." Mateo turned his attention back to Penelope. She was swaying on her feet, the adrenaline rapidly leaving her system, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion and blinding pain. "You can't put weight on this," Mateo stated. Before she could protest, he bent down, hooking one massive arm behind her knees and the other around her wide back. "No, wait, I'm too heavy!" Penelope cried out, thoroughly mortified. The ingrained shame of her weight flared up instantly. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for him to grunt, to drop her, to realize he couldn't lift her. Mateo hoisted her into his arms effortlessly, as if she weighed no more than a silk sheet. He held her tight against his broad chest, his grip firm and incredibly secure. "Do not ever apologize for your body," Matteo growled softly near her ear, his breath hot against her freezing skin. "You are perfect, and you are safe now." Penelope's brain short-circuited. Perfect safe. She was in the arms of Chicago's most lethal criminal, bleeding all over his $1,000 suit, and he was calling her perfect. He carried her past the dining tables and through a heavy velvet curtain at the back, entering a lavish private office. He gently deposited her onto a sprawling leather Chesterfield sofa. The cushions sank comfortably beneath her. Matteo immediately knelt on the Persian rug in front of her. "Dr. Harrison is on his way," Matteo said, pulling a clean white handkerchief from his breast pocket. He reached out and carefully lifted her injured leg, resting her ankle on his thigh. Penelope hissed in pain as he gently dabbed the blood away from the jagged cut on her knee. "I'm sorry," Matteo murmured, his touch shockingly tender for hands that had ended lives. "I know it hurts. I need to see how deep it is." "Why are you doing this?" Penelope finally asked, her voice cracking. "I came here expecting you to kill me. Jimmy stole your money. I'm just the idiot who signed the papers." Matteo paused, his dark eyes rising to meet hers. "You think I didn't know Jimmy was stealing?" Penelope blinked, stunned. You knew." "Jimmy Garrison is a roach," Matteo said coldly, tossing the bloody handkerchief into a nearby trash can. "I knew he was skimming 3 months ago. I was letting the rope out so he would hang himself. But while I was watching his accounts, I started watching his accountant." Penelope's breath hitched. "You were watching me. Closely." Matteo admitted his gaze, dropping to her soft, trembling lips, before returning to her eyes. "I watched you work until midnight every night. I watched you buy coffee for the homeless man outside your building. I watched how that piece of shit Jimmy talked down to you, how he made you feel small when you are the most vibrant, beautiful woman I have ever seen." Penelope felt hot tears prick her eyes. She wanted to look away to hide from the overwhelming intensity in his stare, but she was trapped. "When Jimmy ran, I knew he framed you." Matteo continued, his voice lowering into a dangerous register. "I summoned you here tonight not to collect a debt, Penelope. I summoned you here to offer you my protection. I didn't anticipate the Volkovs getting to you first. That is my failure." He reached up his rough fingers, gently brushing a wet strand of hair from her cheek. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb resting near her lips. "I failed to protect you today." Matteo swore softly, a deadly promise ringing in his tone. "I will never make that mistake again. The men who did this to you won't live to see the sunrise. And Jimmy..." Matteo's smile was terrifying, a baring of teeth that sent a shiver down her spine. "Jimmy thought he could sell you out to the Russians to cover his own skin. He thought you were disposable. I am going to teach him just how valuable you are to me." The heavy oak door of the office swung open, and a man carrying a black medical bag hurried in. Dr. Harrison didn't look like a mob doctor. He looked like a weary ER physician, which he likely was. He froze when he saw the boss of the Navarro family kneeling on the floor, holding a weeping, plus-size woman's leg as if it were spun gold. "Fix her," Matteo commanded, not taking his eyes off Penelope. "And if you cause her any unnecessary pain, Doc, you'll answer to me." As the doctor rushed forward to administer a local anesthetic, Penelope stared at Matteo Navarro. The terror that had fueled her for the last 48 hours began to melt away, replaced by something entirely new, something terrifying in a completely different way. The most dangerous man in Chicago wasn't going to kill her. He was going to wage a war for her. Sunlight pierced the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling Gold Coast penthouse, casting long golden shadows across the flawless Italian marble floor. Penelope awoke gradually, her senses flooded with the unfamiliar scent of expensive cedar and masculine bergamot. She was lying in a massive king-sized bed, surrounded by sheets that felt like liquid silk against her skin. Her right leg, heavily bandaged and throbbing with a dull ache, was carefully propped up on a stack of plush velvet pillows. It took her entirely overwhelmed mind a full minute to process the events of the previous night. The brutal attack in the rain, the terrifying meeting at Il Cacciatore, the Mafia boss who had carried her heavy frame as though she were made of nothing but air. Matteo Navarro stepped into the bedroom, completely shattering her chaotic thoughts. He had discarded his formal suit jacket, wearing only a crisp black button-down shirt that stretched tightly across his muscular chest, the sleeves rolled up to reveal dark, intricate tattoos creeping up his forearms. He carried an ornate silver tray laden with fresh fruit pastries and a steaming cup of dark coffee. "Good morning, Tesoro," Matteo murmured, his deep voice wrapping around her like a warm, heavy blanket. He set the tray on the bedside table and sat on the edge of the mattress, his weight dipping the bed slightly toward him. "Dr. Harrison said you would sleep through the morning. The pain medication was quite strong. How is the knee feeling today?" Penelope pulled the thick silk comforter up to her chin, feeling a deep, agonizing flush of embarrassment warm her cheeks. She was incredibly conscious of her bare shoulders, her soft, round face, devoid of makeup, and the sheer amount of space she took up in his immaculate bed. "It aches, but it is manageable," she replied softly, her voice thick with sleep. "Mr. Navarro, I cannot possibly impose on you like this. I am taking up too much room. I should go home." Matteo's jaw instantly locked, a dangerous flash of irritation sparking in his dark eyes. He leaned forward, bracing his large hands on either side of her hips, entirely trapping her in his intense gravity. "Rule number 1 in my home, Penelope," Matteo commanded gently, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Do not ever speak about yourself with such disrespect. You are not imposing. You do not take up too much room. Your body is a work of art, soft and magnificent, and this bed has never looked better than it does right this very second with you in it. Do you understand me?" Tears pricked her eyes, completely unbidden. Nobody had ever spoken to her like that. Jimmy had spent their entire 3-year relationship subtly suggesting gym memberships, buying her clothes a size too small as motivation, and making her feel utterly monstrous. Matteo looked at her as if she were a goddess carved from marble. She could only manage a small, trembling nod. "Good," Matteo praised his expression, softening as he reached out to brush a stray curl behind her ear. "Eat your breakfast, then we have business to attend to." Carmine located Jimmy's safe house, but the rat had already fled. "I need your brilliant mind to tell me exactly where he went." Determined to prove her worth, Penelope ate quickly. Within 30 minutes, Matteo had transferred her to a luxurious leather armchair in his private study, a heavy mahogany desk placed over her lap to accommodate her injured leg. He provided her with 3 encrypted laptops and a stack of physical ledgers recovered from Jimmy's abandoned office. Penelope fell into the numbers. It was her safe haven. As she cross-referenced the Navarro family's legitimate waste management invoices against the offshore routing numbers, Jimmy had managed a terrifying pattern began to emerge. Jimmy hadn't merely stolen $2 million to pay off a gambling debt. He had fundamentally rewired the syndicate's financial architecture. She quickly formatted her findings into a clear, concise visual for Matteo to understand the gravity of the betrayal. "Matteo!" Penelope called out, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was at her side in a fraction of a second, staring down at the illuminated laptop screen. "He didn't just steal from you," Penelope explained, her finger trembling as she pointed to the destination accounts. "He paid the Russians, Alexei Volkov. Jimmy was intentionally bleeding your accounts dry to fund the Volkov's expansion into the Southside territory. Here are the critical failure points. The Cayman reserves. Jimmy bypassed the dual authentication protocols by forging Penelope's signature, completely draining the family's emergency liquidity. The shipping manifests. He deliberately rerouted 3 major shipments of heavy weaponry directly into Volkov-controlled warehouses. The assassination fund, the final transfer of $950,000, was flagged under a specific coding matrix. It was a bounty. Matteo stared at the screen, his terrifyingly calm demeanor betraying nothing but the temperature in the room plummeted. The silence was deafening heavy with the promise of catastrophic violence. Jimmy hadn't just embezzled money. He had funded a hostile takeover and placed a hit on Matteo's head. Before Matteo could speak, the heavy oak doors of the study burst open. Carmine strode in, his knuckles split and bleeding, a grim smile plastered across his scarred face. "Boss," Carmine announced, tossing a bloodied silver Rolex onto the desk. "The boys caught a rat trying to board a private charter at Midway Airport. Jimmy is in the basement." The underground bunker beneath the Navarro estate was soundproof, lined with concrete, and smelled sharply of copper and bleach. Penelope insisted on going down. She refused to hide in the penthouse, while the man who had ruined her life faced his reckoning. Matteo had initially forbidden it, completely terrified that the violence would traumatize her. But her absolute, unwavering stubbornness had ultimately won him over. He carried her down the steep concrete stairs himself, seating her safely on a metal folding chair in the shadows, wrapping his heavy cashmere coat around her trembling shoulders. Jimmy Garrison was suspended by his wrists from a steel beam in the center of the room. He looked absolutely pathetic. His custom designer suit was shredded and stained, or his face bruised and swollen, and his lips split entirely in 2. He whimpered like a beaten dog as Matteo stepped into the harsh glare of the single overhead spotlight. "Jimmy!" Matteo purred his voice, dropping an octave, resonating with demonic calm. He slowly unbuttoned his cuffs, rolling them up over his tattooed forearms. "You have been incredibly busy." Jimmy coughed, spitting a mixture of blood and saliva onto the concrete floor. "Matteo, please, listen to me. The Russians. Alexei forced me. He threatened to kill me. I had to give them the money." "You transferred the money voluntarily to purchase my shipping routes," Matteo corrected him smoothly, picking up a heavy steel wrench from a nearby metal tray. "You placed a bounty on my head. But honestly, Jimmy, the money is completely irrelevant to me now. Money can be replaced. Routes can be reclaimed. But you made a fatal mistake that I cannot simply overlook." Matteo stepped aside, allowing the harsh spotlight to partially illuminate the corner where Penelope sat, wrapped in his coat. Jimmy squinted through his swollen eyes. When he registered who was sitting there, a look of absolute bewildered disgust crossed his bloody face. "Penny, what the hell are you doing down here?" "Did you bring her here to do the books, Matteo? Is that it?" "She is not here to do the books," Matteo stated coldly. Jimmy let out a breathless, mocking laugh, completely blind to the lethal danger radiating from the Mafia boss. "Wait, you can't be serious. You and her, Jesus Christ, Matteo. You could have any supermodel in Chicago, and you're claiming my sloppy seconds. Look at her. She's a fat, pathetic cow. She couldn't even walk up a flight of stairs without losing her breath. I only kept her around because her firm was useful." The words hit Penelope like a physical blow, digging deep into her lifelong insecurities. She instinctively shrank back into the coat, trying to make her large body disappear into the shadows. Matteo didn't shout. He didn't scream. He moved with the terrifying, blinding speed of a striking viper. The heavy steel wrench swung in a brutal, perfect arc, connecting directly with Jimmy's left kneecap. The sound of shattering bone echoed like a gunshot in the confined concrete room. Jimmy threw his head back, letting out a blood-curdling, agonizing scream that tore from his throat. He thrashed violently against the heavy chains binding his wrists, sobbing and pleading as agony ripped through his nervous system. Matteo stood perfectly still, watching the man writhe. "She apologized to me for being late," Matteo whispered, his voice slicing through Jimmy's pathetic screams. "She was bleeding, terrified, and in excruciating pain because of the thugs you sent after her, and yet she apologized to me." Matteo took a slow, deliberate step closer to the hanging man. "You used her. You mocked her. You completely failed to see the magnificent, intelligent, beautiful queen standing right in front of you. You made her feel small, Jimmy, when she is a goddess who deserves to take up all the space in the world." Matteo raised the wrench again. "This knee is for the pain you caused her yesterday." The wrench descended again, obliterating Jimmy's right kneecap. Another horrifying scream shattered the air, immediately followed by the sound of Jimmy vomiting onto the floor as his body completely succumbed to the catastrophic shock. Matteo casually tossed the bloody wrench onto the metal tray. He didn't spare the whimpering, broken man another glance. He turned his back on the carnage, pulling a pristine, white linen handkerchief from his pocket to wipe a single drop of blood from his cheek. "Carmine," Matteo commanded without looking back. "He's no longer useful. Take him to the docks. Make sure he sinks deep." "With pleasure, boss," Carmine grunted, stepping forward with a sinister grin. Matteo walked directly into the shadows where Penelope was sitting. She was completely frozen, her heart racing uncontrollably, staring at the man who had just committed horrific violence purely to avenge her honor. Matteo knelt before her, entirely disregarding the dirt and grime on the basement floor. He gently took her trembling, soft hands in his. "He will never insult you again. He will never hurt you again," Matteo vowed, pressing a fiercely tender kiss to her knuckles. His dark eyes searched her face, completely stripped of their earlier cruelty, leaving behind nothing but raw, burning devotion. "You belong to me now, Penelope. You are not a pawn. You are not collateral damage. You are the woman who holds my heart, my syndicate, and my entire world in her hands. Will you stay with me?" Penelope looked at the terrifying mob boss kneeling before her. For the very first time in her entire life, she did not feel the need to shrink, to hide, or to apologize for her existence. She felt incredibly powerful. She felt unconditionally loved. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady and resolute. "I will stay." Matteo smiled, a genuine, breathtaking expression that transformed his hardened face. He scooped her effortlessly into his powerful arms, carrying his newly crowned queen out of the dark, bloody basement and up toward the blinding light of their new empire. Did this thrilling Mafia romance keep you on the absolute edge of your seat? Penelope and Matteo's intense journey from a bloody alleyway to ruling the Chicago underground proves that true power lies in unconditional loyalty and devotion. If you loved this dramatic twist on dark romance and want more gripping stories, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fiction lovers, and subscribe to our channel for weekly heart-pounding tales. Your continued support means the world